Hi, welcome back. This is Dr. Burton. We've been going over a series of videos discussing critical theory, some of the history behind critical theory, and I've been trying to make the case that there's a worldview here that we need to reckon with. And a worldview has a structure, and I argue the basic piece is epistemology. How do we know? And I think that critical theory borrows its epistemology from Nietzsche, and I hope to make the case over the next few videos that Nietzsche kind of breaks epistemology for the West. And I have a series of quotes I want to go over. Basically, Nietzsche's take on reason. He is a philosopher that does not think that we could know what is. And he divorces thinking from being. He divorces logos from ontos. Logos is reason in our mind and reason in the world. He breaks that. And I want to make the case that that breaking of reason from being is what undergirds the epistemology of critical theory. So these next few videos are going to be about Nietzsche's epistemology, and then I'm going to hopefully connect that with contemporary critical theory. Now, critical theorists, and I'm talking about the Frankfurt School original scholars, have been influenced by Nietzsche, and I'll make those connections as well. But they've also been influenced by Marx and Freud and other thinkers, Rousseau. So not all of their thinking comes from Nietzsche, but I'm going to suggest that their thinking about epistemology definitely comes from Nietzsche. So this is where I've done the bulk of my study in epistemology, the field of philosophy that asks the question, how do we know and what is knowledge? I wrote my book on this, Retrieving Knowledge, A Socratic Response to Skepticism, and this book is based on my dissertation. I will show you the title page from that. Logos and Dialogos, Reading Plato's Theaetetus Under the Long Shadow of Nietzsche. So in my dissertation, I looked at a historical development of the philosopher's search for the logos, which is an explanation for the fit between our minds and the world. And the first philosophers were materialists. All that exists is matter. One of those philosophers was Heraclitus. Heraclitus talked about the logos, but he had no way of grounding the logos in matter because he thought matter was in flux, constant motion, always changing. He also thought we were in that motion and change too. So the first era of philosophy was searching for the logos, but failed to ground the logos because of their materialism. And in my book, I argue that this is what leads to their skepticism. And Socrates responds to that skepticism by arguing against their empiricism, their materialism, skepticism, and ethical relativism. But in the process of doing my dissertation, I came across the opposite position to Socrates, and that was Frederick Nietzsche. He dies in 1900, German philosopher. He began as a philologist, that's the word. I'm looking for the word. Philologist, which is a linguist, basically, a lover of the logos. And the logos, again, is the fit between, well, the logos is in our mind, but other philosophers have said it's in the world too. It's the order and structure of the world. It's why we can understand things. So he begins as a lover of the logos, but he ends as an anti-logos philosopher. He hates the logos. And I think he sets out to destroy the logos. Now, the logos happens to also be a doctrine within Christian philosophy theology. It comes from the Gospel of John. I also wrote about that in my book. There's some lectures on my website retphi.com, where I go over that logos. My purpose here is to say that there's this history of philosophy and the search for the logos from the pre-Socratics to Nietzsche that Nietzsche seems to want to break. Now, he thinks he's going back to the pre-Socratic philosophers, but he is doing something that they didn't do. He is going to say there is no fit between our mind and the world. He is going to say reason is not ontological. Now, if you want to know more about reason being ontological, go look at my series, the Retrieving Reason podcast. I talk about reason is ontological in that podcast. That just means reason, the laws of thought, applies to being, the world. Nietzsche is going to say, no, it does not. He's going to say the laws of thought are a tool that we humans invented, particularly the philosophers have invented, and we invented it to impose order on the world of flux and chaos. It's a fiction. And I hope to draw that out, those ideas that he has about reason and how it does not apply to being. When you divorce reason from being, being is unknowable, and we can only impose force on the world and also on one another to impose order. So he thinks we need to use reason as a tool. It's an instrument, and it's an instrument of the will to impose order and to make things controllable in the world of flux. Okay, so I think he's wrong. I think he's dead wrong, and I think, I don't know, post-Nietzschean philosophy takes that assumption and is pressing it to the limits now. So the things that we talk about in popular critical theory, like identity, gender fluidity, maybe even intersectionality, have roots in these ideas, particularly when it comes to self-fashioning, creating the self, and how we know things from our own perspective, standpoint epistemology. It comes from this idea that we can't know being, we can't know the world. All we have are our perspectives, and our perspectives are in conflict, and so we have a power struggle. That comes directly from this idea of separating reason from being. Now, I wrote an appendix to my dissertation. It didn't make it into my book, but it's all the quotes I could find on Nietzsche's view of reason. Now, when I talk about reason, I love reason. I'm stuck on reason. I did a 15-part podcast series on reason and where I think about it. You can go look at those. But when I talk about reason, I mean the laws of thought. The law of identity. A is A. A is A means a thing is what it is. iPhone is iPhone. Pencil is pencil. Rock is rock. So Nietzsche's going to say no. The laws of thought are just tools, instruments. When I say iPhone is iPhone, it's not talking about a being out there. It's an order I've imposed, which is almost a view of humans constructing reality. It is. I mean, reality isn't something that's presented to us to be grasped by us. Reality is a flux and a flow that we craft by placing order on it. So we are world constructors. Okay? Now, I want to go through some of these quotes to bring it out. And I want you to think about critical theory. When you hear these people from the perspective of critical theory speaking, ask yourself, is this something that we find in Nietzsche's epistemology? All right. So these are chronologically ordered from his works, and the first book he wrote is called the Pre-Platonic Philosopher. So he was studying the philosophers before Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. He liked them because they were materialists, and particularly Heraclitus was into the flux doctrine, and Nietzsche endorses that view of reality. So here's Nietzsche speaking. Well, this is the intuitive perception of Heraclitus. There is no thing of which we may say it is. He rejects being. He knows only becoming, the flowing. He considers belief in something persistent as error and foolishness. To this he adds this thought: that which becomes is one thing in eternal transformation. And the law of this eternal transformation, the logos in all things, is precisely this one, fire. Thus, the one overall becoming is itself law. That it becomes and how it becomes is its work. And then I have some footnotes. I'd like to read those footnotes to you because I think this is a very important first statement that we see of the logos, which we can see what does Heraclitus mean by it and what does Nietzsche mean by it. Nietzsche self-identifies with Heraclitus. This is my commentary. The most fundamental feature of Heraclitus thinking is the logos. That's true. Yet, in his discussion of Heraclitus, Nietzsche hardly mentions Heraclitus's logos. This quote represents one of the rare mentions of Heraclitus's logos. Here it seems that Nietzsche identifies Heraclitus' logos with a law of eternal transformation. Nietzsche, in order to remain consistent with his rejection of reason as ontological, has to change the meaning of Heraclitean logos as rational mind. That's what Heraclitus thought it was. Greg Whitlock, in his commentary on the Pre-Platonic Philosophers, says, Heraclitus comprehended the logos, the all-pervasive intelligence. This logos is intelligence or mind, which would later be called nous by the pre-Platonic philosophers. Nietzsche insists that logos is an intelligence, which he further identifies as will. This is an especially poignant moment in the lecture series. Heraclitean logos becomes identified with the notion of will. Nietzsche's own conceptual modifications of the will are already underway here, informed in part by the pre-Platonics and in part by his scientific readings. Whitlock sees in Nietzsche's identification of logos with will the beginning of his thinking about the will to power that will be the causal force that undergirds his version of the flux doctrine in his later thinking. To change logos to will is a radical revaluation indeed. Heraclitus didn't think it was the will. He couldn't explain why there was a mind in matter. That was his, hang up, I'd say. Also, in another footnote here I have, it must be kept in mind that this is how Nietzsche understands Heraclitus. Eva Braun does not understand Heraclitus in this way. She wrote a book about Heraclitus on logos. Very good book. She doesn't think Nietzsche's right. So she says Nietzsche takes his co-opted predecessor to deny both the separation between thought and nature as the beginning of being. He explains Heraclitus' paradoxes as the splendid result of the intuitive anti-rationalism that guides his representation of a force-replete world. And later she says, talk of willful misconstrual. She loves Heraclitus, I do too, and his search for the logos, but Nietzsche interprets him in his own way. And notice this, intuitive anti-rationalism. He is saying Heraclitus is basing his insight into the logos as intuitive perception, intuition. I have a hunch that a lot of what's driving critical theory is intuition. Intuition has to do with sign and reality and feeling based. It's anti-rational, feeling based. All right, that's just one quote. We could probably do this forever, right? All right, second quote. If everything is in becoming, change, then accordingly, predicates cannot adhere to a thing, but rather likewise must be in the flow of becoming. So in classic Aristotelian logic, a judgment or a statement, I'm losing the word again here, proposition. A proposition has a subject term and a predicate term. Humans are rational. Subject is the thing the predicate adheres to. The subject is a being. Nietzsche is saying if everything is becoming, then accordingly predicates, rational, cannot adhere to a subject, a thing, but rather likewise must be in the flow of becoming. So predicates are predicates are predicates are predicates. There's no being. This is crazy if you think about it. There is no subject. So we can't say anything is anything. So his epistemology begins with reason does not apply to being, and then his metaphysics carries that to all is becoming. All right. This is about Parmenides now. Parmenides is the philosopher who spoke about being, whereas Heraclitus was the philosopher who spoke about logos. Nietzsche doesn't like this talk of being. He denies being. Being is what is. Okay, so here's a quote from Nietzsche. It's a long one. Bear with me. In speaking about Parmenides, Nietzsche explains that Parmenides concludes we can conceive only being. Of not being, we can have no idea. Possessing ideas and believing in being merge together. That is a Parmenides view. That is the origin of the idea of the isomorphism between reason and being, or reason is ontological. There is no not being. Only being exists. There's no non-being. So now we have being and non-being, A and non-A, the law of non-contradiction, and it applies to the world. There's an isomorphism, a fit between our thinking, reason, the laws of thought, and being, the laws of being. Nietzsche says no. In this merging together, we see Nietzsche's recognition of Parmenides' contribution to the stage in philosophical development where reason applies to being. Nietzsche goes on to observe of Parmenides' thought. This is a quote from Nietzsche now. Thus, logos recognizes the true essence of things. In other words, the abstractions and the perceptions of sensation are only deceptions. That's Nietzsche's assessment of what happens if we go with Parmenides' thinking. Here, Nietzsche identifies a distinction between the pursuit of truth by means of logos, reason, and that of the perception of senses. So Nietzsche goes with the senses. He is going to be a radical empiricist. All of our knowledge is through the senses. Here's Nietzsche's quote. He goes on to say that here we have an unnatural tearing apart of the intellect. The consequence must finally be a dichotomy between spirit, the faculty of abstraction, and bodies, lower sensory apparatus. And we recognize the ethical consequences already in Plato, the philosopher's task to liberate himself from the body, meaning from the senses. This is the most dangerous of false paths, for no true philosophy can construct itself from this empty hull. Nietzsche goes on to show how dialectic and logic stem from the Parmenidean conflation of reason and being. Okay, so there's two things going on here. One, Parmenides identifies reason and being as being connected. There's an isomorphism between thinking and being. Nietzsche sees that Plato develops this and maybe even does this thing where thinking is in our mind, and that's the soul, and sensation is in the body, and these are divorced in Plato. The soul is good and it goes to another place to get the good. The body is bad, and is the source of all ignorance. So yeah, maybe that's a mistake in Plato, and Nietzsche is seeing that mistake. I would reject that idea as well, but Nietzsche's going further than just saying we shouldn't divorce soul from body. He's saying we shouldn't join thinking to being. That's worse. Okay, we can say, yeah, Plato was wrong, but we can't say thinking doesn't apply to being. We have to go, wait a minute, where did Plato go wrong and where did he go right? This is the hard work. You can't just chuck things because it's wrong in one place. You have to go, hang on, there's an error here. Let's think it through and see what should we hold on to and what should we not hold on to. We don't get to just critique, right? Nietzsche loves to critique, by the way. All right, I'm going to pause here because we've gone long, and I do want to go through more. Maybe I'll pick out the best ones. But I do think this hard work of going through Nietzsche's quotes to see what he meant by the flux, and the flux not applying, that there's no being and reason doesn't apply to being. Because that's an idea that definitely carries over to the Frankfurt School and is being played out in popular critical theory in a lot of places. And I say if we could nail that down, we can identify it and we can say, no, that's an error. Just like Nietzsche identifies an error in Plato, we can identify errors in critical theory. We're doing critical thinking on critical theory. Nietzsche would be happy, I think, if we just thought critically. All right, I'm going to pause here. I'll see you on the other side. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Subscribing really helps because then I don't have to remind everyone to go find my videos. You just get a little reminder and you know it's there. All right, thanks, and I'll talk to you later.